Let's talk about service providers. Now, this is one of the core features of Laravel, and I think its importance comes immediately after the importance of the application.php in Laravel. Laravel provides a great deal of customization using service providers, and this is actually a space for us to be able to do whatever we want to do as soon as the application is booted. So let's head over to our app service provider. Now, all service providers extend from Illuminate Support Service Provider, and they might or might not implement this boot and register methods. Now, let's talk a little bit about the difference between these two. During the boot process, Laravel registers its service providers, and these service providers are the ones that are registered in the config app.php. So right here, it's going to go through this provider array and register each and every one of these providers. How does it do that? It goes to each and every one of those service providers and it calls their register method. So for example, if we choose any of the providers, for example, the broadcast service provider, we can see its register method, and basically what it does is it's registering the manager into the container, the contract into the container, aliasing the broadcast manager and the factory and all of that good stuff. Okay, Laravel during its boot sequence is going to call only the register method on each and every one of the providers that are specified in the app.php providers array. Next thing, after the boot process has been completed, it's now going to call the boot method on each and every one of those providers. Therefore, this broadcast service provider can have a boot method, and this boot method is going to be called by Laravel after the application has been booted. So after Illuminate has finished running. So if you have a service provider like the app service provider that is empty and provided to us by Laravel, if you want to bind anything to the container, register method is where you're gonna do it. Okay, so put things into the container in the register method, but never try to get things out of the container, because remember, the register method is called when Laravel is still in the process of registering service providers. Therefore, you might be getting something out of the container, meanwhile it's not yet been put into the container by Laravel. Okay, so make sure you only put things into the container in the register provider. So for you to see this, if we visit whatever provider by Laravel, for example the database service provider, it's only gonna be doing registration. Okay, that's all it's gonna do. It's never gonna try to get something out of the container. If you check out the file system service provider and you also go to its register method, it is putting things into the container. Okay, registering things into the container, it's not getting anything out. So if you have custom service providers or you want to use service providers like the app service provider, make sure you're not getting things out of the container here, but you're putting things in. And then once Laravel is completely booted, it's going to call each and every boot method of each and every provider. So for example, this is where you can maybe get Eloquent out of the container or the database or whatever you want to get out of the container. Okay, so boot method after Laravel has booted. Register method during the registration process of Laravel, registering the service providers. Okay, now how could we use a service provider? Remember, we have the auth route method. I'm going to use this as an example. So right here we have this auth route method, and like we saw in our facades auth, it's calling the auth method in the router.php, and what this auth method is doing is simply registering some routes, right? So this is one of the things we can do in our service provider. We can register a new route. For example, if we don't want to dynamically or put those routes in the web.php, or if those routes are supposed to be registered only after a condition is met, then the service provider is a very good place to go. We also have a route service provider that Laravel provides for us. So if it has anything to do with routes, then you can do it in the boot method of the route service provider. If it has anything to do with broadcasting, then maybe the broadcast service provider is a good place to register. For example, the broadcast service provider actually registers some routes in its boot method. Okay, just like we were talking about. So why don't we have some fun with service providers to see how we can actually generate our own and customize it however we like. I'm gonna create a new provider, PHP Artisan make provider, and most of the time when you're creating a new provider, it would be because you want to handle a particular thing in your application. So let's say we want to communicate with a Medium API, and we need to obviously pull in the PHP client. So here it is. Go ahead and run composer required this, and then it looks like for us to use this, we need a new instance of the Medium class, and we need to pass in these credentials. So where is the best place for us to put this? The controller might be a first place to start, but then every time you want to use Medium, you're gonna say new Medium, which is not bad, but then imagine newing up this class multiple times over and over in your application. Meanwhile, you can just tell Laravel to give it to you. So the best place to put this would be into a separate service provider, or you can also put it in the app service provider. But just so we learn how to create our own service providers, we can create a Medium service provider, pass in these credentials, and tell Laravel anytime we want an instance of Medium, do this and give it to us. Okay, let's go ahead and do that. Make provider Medium service provider. Now that's created for us. If we head over to our app directory providers, we have this Medium service provider that has been created for us. And remember, our boot method is after registration and our register method is during registration. Therefore, what we can do is bind something into the container. So binding is simply like telling Laravel, take this and keep for us. Whenever we want it, give it back to us. Okay, we want to store an instance of Medium in our container, and we want Laravel to give it to us every time we need it, rather than creating a new instance like 10 times in our controllers, right? So I'll import this class. So use this class right here, and during the registration process, I'm gonna tell Laravel, okay, since you're registering things and you're calling this register method for my Medium service provider, please keep a Medium PHP SDK, and what you're going to be keeping is an instance of Medium, and we need to pass in the credentials. Okay, because for us to instantiate this class, we need some credentials. And actually, if you type hint this in any controller for dependency injection, Laravel would understand that. But then if you're passing in some credentials, then you need to tell Laravel how to bind this into the container. And what we are doing here, we're telling Laravel, whenever we ask for this key, give us this. And how do we get our credentials? Since we learned in the last lesson that we can actually have our custom configuration files, let's create a new config file just for our Medium API. So config/medium.php, and right here we just need to return an array, right? So return, and I'm gonna copy this configurations array from this page and I'm gonna paste that in. Okay, so this is the configuration, and you can go ahead and use env to get this from the .env file if you wish. And in your Medium service provider, you just need to call config, right? So config get Medium, and that's it. It's going to give us whatever is returned from that medium.php file. Okay, so we are passing the configuration, and we are telling Laravel every time we need Medium, just give us a new instance with this configuration. Now, during the boot process, Laravel is going to register this, and every time in our application where we need this, Laravel is going to give it to us. Let's go ahead and request this in our web.php and see what we get. Let's dive down, and we'll call a resolve helper method that Laravel gives us, and this is simply telling Laravel that thing that we put into the container with this name, we want it right now. Okay, so we can save it in a variable. Let me just show you right here. So we can say instance of Medium equals resolve this from the container. So this is the instance of Medium that we want, and then let's dive down that instance right here. So if I refresh my homepage, yeah, we get an error, and I think you should know why we get this error. Because we've created our service provider, but we haven't told Laravel to load this service provider, right? So for us to tell Laravel, this is one of the service providers we want you to load, we need to head over to our configuration file and tell Laravel, when you load in service providers, make sure you load the Medium service provider. Okay, so quick refresh again. There we go. We have our instance of Medium. This tells Laravel to also boot or call the register method, and the register method binds that key to our container. And this is the instance that we are asking for in our web.php. Now, what can we do in the boot method? Like I said, the boot method is after everything has happened. Therefore, we can ask for anything from the container. For example, in this case, let's call the container and ask for the router, and this app actually is the container or the application which extends the container, and it's actually saved as an app property on all service providers. Okay, so this app make router simply means get the router, or you can actually use the resolve method that we were using in our web.php. And since we have our router, sure enough, we have the get method, and we can define our get method to define a new route, and we can say this new route is for Medium, and we can pass in a closure to be executed when we visit that route. So let's just return Medium home, for example, a string. Okay, so we've registered a new route in our boot method. Now let's visit that home, so Medium, and sure enough, we have Medium home. Therefore, just in a nutshell, we can see that Laravel provides us a really easy way to hook into the system by creating service providers. So you can customize a lot of things. For example, you can even replace the router in a custom route service provider. You can replace the broadcasting driver if you want to implement your own, just by creating a service provider and binding a key, and every time Laravel is requested for that key, it's going to return whatever is in the closure. So we can see how Laravel gives us really easy customization using service providers. We have a boot method, a register method. We can register whatever we want to register into the container, and in our boot method, whatever we want to do, maybe send an email when a particular route is visited, or do whatever we want, we can do that in the boot method. Okay, so that's how we play around with service providers to customize Laravel.